When Roboute Guilliman came back from the dead after 10,000 years, he woke into an Imperium he barely recognized. A corpse-worshipping, witch-burning, crumbling tyranny that had taken everything he built and turned it into a religion he never wanted. And the first thing he did was read. The Avenging Son consumed 10,000 years of history, drank in every horror the Imperium had committed in his absence, absorbed the full weight of what his father's dream had become. His first response to this is preserved in Guy Haley's Dark Imperium trilogy, in the passages where Guilliman addresses the Emperor silently, speaking to a golden throne that can't reply, to the empty-eyed skull of the most powerful being humanity ever produced, now entombed in a machine keeping him technically alive while trillions kneel before him. Why do I still live? What more do you want from me? I gave everything I had to you, to them. Look what they've made of our dream. This bloated, rotting carcass of an empire is driven not by reason and hope, but by fear, hate, and ignorance. Better that we had all burned in the fires of Horus's ambition than lived to see this. That isn't a man arriving home. That is a man arriving at a crime scene who decides, despite everything, to stay and work. He stayed. He reorganized the Senatorum Imperialis, stripping accumulated power from high lords who had grown comfortable in the Emperor's long absence. He deployed the Primarchs Space Marines, hundreds of thousands of transhuman warriors Archmagus Dominus Belisarius Call had spent 10,000 years preparing under his prior commission, and launched the Indomitus Crusade to hold the galaxy together after the Great Rift split it across the sky. He reforms what he can and grimly tolerates what he can't. He is constitutionally incapable of comfortable lies. The evidence runs through every page of the Dark Imperium trilogy. He debates Frater Matthew, a militant apostolic priest of the ecclesiarchy, precisely the kind of figure a careful politician would manage with deference and a careful smile, and tells him without apology that the emperor isn't infallible, that Primarchs failed, that the Great Crusade wasn't the perfect endeavor the faithful have made it. He reflects in his private monologue that the emperor loves no one man and can't afford affection, that his Primarchs were weapons, that was all, and wonders whether the solution had to be built on lies, lies upon lies. He thinks, with an exactness that could pass for contempt, that if the emperor descended from the golden throne and proclaimed he wasn't a god, the faithful would burn him as a heretic. He does not hide these thoughts. He does not manage them. He thinks them and says them and lives within the contradiction of despising the imperial cult while running an empire that would collapse without it. Dark Imperium is precise about his governing method. Consideration, evaluation, action. That was his way. Roboute Guilliman wasn't a slave to impulse. He even corrected subordinates for years when they attributed sayings to him that weren't his, insisting to anyone who would listen that many of his supposed pronouncements were apocryphal, before finally giving up in exasperation because the Imperium preferred its preconceptions of him to the living evidence standing in front of them. He cared enough about the truth to fight for it against his own mythology, and eventually lost that particular battle to the institutional inertia he returned to fight. This is the man who, on one specific subject, has gone quiet. Games Workshop has never publicly confirmed what happened to the 3 Ind and 11th Legions, and what follows is interpretation, built from character, access, and documented precedent. But it's interpretation that runs with the grain of everything the canon tells us about this man. Guilliman has discovered the truth about the lost Primarchs.
He has access that no mortal inquisitor, no high lord, no space marine could match. And having found the truth,
He made the same choice the Emperor made 10,000 years before. He buried it, because the most principled son the Emperor ever made looked at this one secret and understood that honesty, here, would kill the Imperium he came back to save. Every prosecution requires means. For Guilliman to have found the truth, he needs access. Not the casual access of a curious observer, but the structural authority to open what others can't touch. He has it. The Lord Commander of the Imperium holds the highest military rank in the entire Imperium of man, second only to the Emperor himself. He chairs the Senatorum Imperialis. He sits above all high lords of Terra. He commands the full administrative apparatus of the Adeptus Terra. He carried the Emperor's own sword out of that final audience in the inner sanctum of the Imperial Palace, an audience in which, as the canon records it, the Emperor communicated with him directly after 10,000 years of the Golden Throne's silence. When Guilliman directs that archives be opened, they open. That formal authority covers everything that survived the heresy and 10 millennia of institutional decay, including the administrative ghosts of the 10th and 11th legions. Those files didn't simply vanish into time. The 10 legions' records reportedly returned structural absence. The data architecture acknowledges that a slot exists. The content is gone, erased with an intentionality that requires active decision rather than passive neglect. The 11th Legion's files carry a different marker still, censored by imperial decree, not lost in the chaos of war, deliberately locked by the authority that commissioned the lock. Two different erasures pointing toward two different fates, and even in the texture of the deletion, there is information for a mind trained to read it. Then there is Belisarius' call. Guilliman commissioned him during the final stages of the heresy to secretly develop improved Astartes, a project that ran in secret for 10,000 years and produced the Primarchs Space Marines. Call's data caches represent one of the most extensive surviving repositories of pre-heresy material accessible in M42. Within them is the Sang Primus port, described in the lore as containing perfect copies of the genetic material harvested from all 20 of the original Primarchs. All 20, including the 2 the Emperor struck from every other record. The biological truth of the lost Primarchs survived the Purge, preserved in Call's custody, and Call answers to Guilliman. In Dark Imperium, the Call Inferior, Call's AI facsimile, encoded with his knowledge and patterns, directly raises the 2 forgotten Primarchs and their legions in conversation with Guilliman. This is published Black Library canon. Call's representative places the subject on the table in M42, explicitly, in person. And crucially, Guilliman does not react with surprise. He already knows of them. The conversation isn't a revelation. It's a reminder of something he is already carrying. He reportedly founded the Historiator Order specifically to, as the lore records it, pry apart the history and secrets of the Imperium and the galaxy. An organization operating under his direct mandate, tasked with unearthing what was buried across 10 millennia of deliberate suppression. If it has been working as commissioned, the complete absence of any public finding about the 10th or 11th is the kind of silence that accumulates into a shape. Some of the original truth is likely irretrievable. Malcador reportedly destroyed certain records rather than merely sealing them, burned rather than locked because locked things can be unlocked, and what was burned can't be recovered even by the Lord Commander.
But the structural evidence of the deletion,
the Sang Primus port's silent presence in Call's archive, the Call Inferior's direct reference in the most recent major Black Library trilogy, and the Historiator's mandate give Guilliman confirmed in-lore exposure to the shape of what was done. He was confronted with the subject. He encountered the genetic survival of two erased Primarchs through his closest technical collaborator. He chairs the organization whose explicit mission is exactly this investigation. Whatever full picture he assembled from what remained, it was enough to read the original decision clearly. And the original decision was made by a man who understood the stakes better than anyone alive. To understand what those archives contain, or deliberately don't, you need to understand the scale of what the Emperor originally did. There were 20 Primarchs. The Emperor forged them in the gene vaults beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, invested them with superhuman capability and warp-touched charisma, and scattered them across the galaxy in a catastrophe of chaos interference before the Great Crusade reunited father and sons across the stars. 20 legions, 20 gene-forged demigods, the founding instrument of the Imperium of man. The Primarchs of the Tuned and 11th Legions are gone from every surviving record. Their codex entries across multiple editions skip directly from Legion 1 to Legion 3 and from Legion 10 to Legion 12, as though those numbers were never assigned to living men. The Lexicanum, citing Forge World material, places the erasure at least 43 standard years before the Dropsite massacre at Istvan V, squarely in the middle of the Great Crusade, at the height of the Emperor's civilizational project, a century before anyone had yet heard the name Horus heresy. What followed that decree was systematic and total. Administrative files wiped, formal legion rolls deleted, statues removed from halls where Primarchs were commemorated, visual records expunged from remembrancer archives, official histories corrected. The goal, reconstructible from the surviving residue, was that 10,000 years later nobody could prove those legions had ever existed. For two bodies of tens of thousands of transhuman warriors each, for two sons of the Emperor who had stood on battlefields alongside Horus and Guilliman and Rogal Dorn, the goal was non-existence. A hole in the middle of history shaped precisely like something that had been removed. To a remarkable degree, it worked. Even the surviving Primarchs weren't told the full truth. Corvus Corax, Primarch of the 19th Legion, noticed upon his rediscovery by the Emperor that he had only 17 brothers despite holding the 19th number. He raised this directly. The Emperor's response, as the Horus heresy canon records it, was visible sorrow and a changed subject. A father who couldn't answer his own son about two brothers who no longer officially existed, who couldn't give the grief a name, and who chose, deliberately, to defer the question rather than answer it. That scene is one of the quietest horrors in the entire pre-heresy canon. A father, with the power to reshape civilizations, unable to speak about two of his children. The only canonical statement about why the erasure happened comes from Malcador the Sigillite in the short story The Chamber at the End of Memory. Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, not a man given to diplomatic restraint, cornered Malcador about the missing brothers. He was the most loyal Primarch alive, the man Malcador trusted above all others during the siege of Terra itself. If anyone deserved the truth, it was Dorn. Malcador told him only that what the lost Primarchs did threatened the ideals of the entire Great Crusade. Full stop. Not that they failed. Not that they fell to chaos. They threatened the ideals of the entire project upon which the Imperium's founding mythology rested.
And to the most trusted Primarch alive, that was all Malcador would say. The in-universe designations surviving at the margins of the lore are telling. The 3rd Legion carries the marker of the Forgotten. The Elith carries the marker of the Purged. Different words for different fates. one implying something quieter, a shame too deep to name, one carrying edges, an active and violent removal rather than a quiet erasure. The emperor treated two different problems with two different responses, and then erased both with equal thoroughness. 43 years before Istvan V, the emperor made the calculation. He looked at whatever the Thurned and Alith had done or become, judged the truth unmanageable, and decided the record had to end. Not just the Primarchs themselves, the record. Imagine encountering that file. Not the clean canonical summary with its conspicuous absences, but the actual administrative residue, the error codes where records should be, the lock marked censored by imperial decree with no key attached, the Sang Primus port in Call's laboratory still carrying the genetic signature of two men who officially never lived. Guilliman isn't a sentimental reader. He is an administrator, a logistician, a man the canon describes as being able to process information at a rate that outpaced the Adeptus Mechanicus's finest logic engines, planning entire planetary invasions in his mind in moments, absorbing the full horror of 10,000 years of imperial history in the days after his resurrection. He reads what is in front of him and extracts what it means. What is in front of him? 2 legions erased at least 43 years before the heresy, in the middle of the Great Crusade's most successful period, with a thoroughness that required the full machinery of the emperor's administration and the silence of every surviving Primarch simultaneously. Malcador, who ran the Knights Errant, managed the Grey Knights' founding, controlled the most classified operations of the entire heresy era, described the reason to the most loyal Primarch alive as a threat to the ideals of the entire crusade, and then stopped. The scale of the suppression is itself information. When the emperor erased the lost Primarchs, he committed the full apparatus of imperial power to a project of historical non-existence. That isn't the response to a military failure. The response to a military failure is a monument and a sober entry in the record. The response to corruption is censure and dissolution. This, the total removal of historical existence, the binding of surviving Primarchs to permanent silence, the effort to ensure the very numbers 2 and 11 would sit in the codex like gaps in a sentence, is the response to something whose truth itself is the threat, not the Primarchs, the knowledge of why they had to go. Guilliman, who spent his entire first tenure as Lord Commander building the Codex Astartes specifically to prevent any single force from destabilizing the Imperium, reads that suppression and understands exactly what it means. And then he understands something deeper still. Malcador told Dorn the crimes threatened the ideals of the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade was an ideological project as much as a military one, built on the imperial truth, the secular, rationalist framework that declared the age of gods and superstition over, the foundation on which the Imperium was supposed to stand. A threat to the ideals of the Great Crusade isn't an embarrassment to manage, it's a wound to the premise. He closes the file. The tragedy of Roboute Guilliman isn't that he is dishonest. The tragedy is that he is rational. And rationality, in the Imperium of M42, produces the same answer regardless of who runs the calculation. He hates the imperial cult. Dark Imperium establishes this with the exhaustive detail an author uses when he wants the contradiction to have full weight. He argues with Frater Mathieu that the emperor was never a god, denied he was a god, and has been wrongly elevated by men who saw power and mistook it for divinity. He reflects that the emperor allowed the faithful to love him and to believe he loved them in return, though he didn't. He wonders if any of the founding project had to be built on lies.
He despises the ecclesiarchy's corruption of everything his father stood for, and knows it's precisely that, a corruption, a lie, a mass delusion manufactured from the bones of a secular, rationalist project. And yet, he does not dismantle the ecclesiarchy. He does not issue a proclamation correcting the cult's fundamental error. He allows religious veneration to continue, guides it, in some ways deploys it deliberately, because the Imperium at war, a civilization of trillions holding crumbling lines against daemons, Xenos incursions, and a galaxy actively tearing itself apart, needs something to fight for. Faith, even false faith, keeps people at their posts when reason would tell them to run. He has demonstrated this calculus in events the canon confirms. During the Horus heresy, when Guilliman believed Terra had fallen and established Imperium Secundus on Macragge, he built a legitimate emergency government with loyal Primarchs at its head to preserve the Emperor's secular vision. When evidence emerged that Terra still stood, he agreed to dissolve it. He agreed to burn all record that it had ever existed. A Primarch who is constitutionally opposed to comfortable lies looked at the historical fact that loyal sons had effectively fragmented the Imperium in their moment of greatest crisis, decided that truth was too destabilizing to preserve, and burned the records. Not from shame, from the same cold institutional logic he applies to every other governing decision. He disbanded the unnumbered sons, the enormous Primarchs formations built on his prior commission over 10,000 years, earlier than planned due to political pressure on Terra and fear that maintaining them would be read as personal designs on the throne. He suppressed a visible demonstration of his own military capability because the optics would have fractured the institutional mechanisms he needed intact to do anything else at all. The Primarchs program itself ran in secret for the entire 10 millennia span of its development on his direct commission. Strategically significant secrets, maintained for institutional reasons, across timescales measured in millennia. This isn't aberrant behavior for Guilliman. This is the character. Apply this calculus to the lost Primarchs. The Imperium in M42 isn't merely struggling. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in two. Daemon Primarchs walk physical battlefields in person. Every world that holds its line does so because its defenders believe in the Emperor, in the founding mythology, in the idea that mankind's 10,000-year project through darkness means something worth dying for. The imperial cult, which Guilliman privately despises, is the structural support bearing the weight of this belief. Without it, there is no mechanism to mobilize trillions of humans under a single banner when every rational analysis suggests retreat. The lost Primarchs represent a crack in that foundation far deeper than anything Guilliman has yet chosen to expose. Malcador told the most loyal Primarch alive that what they did threatened the ideals of the entire Great Crusade, the founding act, the origin story, the premise of the civilization. A truth at that depth doesn't merely embarrass the mythology, it interrogates the premise. Remove the premise from a structure already held together by faith rather than reason, in the middle of an existential war, and what you have isn't a reformed Imperium. You have a faster collapse. Guilliman can already price the cost of uncomfortable truths. He pays it daily, managing a theocracy he despises because the alternative is worse.
He knows that cost has a threshold. He knows that beyond the threshold, the cure is worse than the disease. And he knows, with the same precision he brings to planetary invasions, exactly which side of that threshold this secret lives on. He closes the file again. The tragedy isn't that Guilliman has become his father everywhere. He hasn't. He is in documented, explicit opposition to the emperor's methods across almost every dimension of governance. He condemns the emperor's policy of concealing the nature of chaos from the Primarchs, the deliberate secrecy that contributed directly to the heresy's momentum, the deception that cost them Horus and 8 more. He accuses the emperor of treating the Primarchs as weapons rather than sons, of building a civilization on lies when truth might have served better. The internal monologue of Dark Imperium gives us the full indictment. The emperor loves no one man, can't afford affection, didn't love his sons. And Guilliman asks whether the solution had to be built on lies, lies upon lies. He finds it hard to forgive. He came back specifically to be the version of his father's project that doesn't require that level of deception. But he also thought this. I never wanted to be a tyrant, thought the Primarch. Perhaps my father didn't wish to be so either. History has roles for us that can't be denied. We are but pieces on the board of eternity. Those two positions inhabit the same mind simultaneously. The man who can't forgive his father for building on lies has concluded that history assigns roles which can't be refused. He sees the parallel. He isn't unaware of it. He has named it. And he has decided, with the same cold institutional logic he brings to everything, that being the Primarch who tells the full truth about the lost Primarchs would cost more than the Imperium can survive paying. We constantly battle the sins of the fathers, thought Guilliman. That is no less true on an eternal scale than it's within the history of a single world. We suffer because of those that have gone before. He wrote this. He thinks this. He has fully internalized the tragedy of his position, that he is perpetuating precisely what he returned to dismantle, finding those reasons sufficient, and recognizing the resemblance clearly enough to name it in the privacy of his own thoughts. The emperor allowed his sons to believe he loved them. He didn't. His Primarchs were weapons. Guilliman knows this and condemns it explicitly. And on the question of the lost Primarchs, Guilliman has decided that the trillions of faithful, the guardsmen dying on 10,000 worlds, the PDF soldiers who have never read a history book but fight because their God tells them humanity must endure, are also, in their way, to be managed. Not deceived in technical terms, directed according to their existing beliefs, shielded from the truth that would make them less effective instruments of survival. Dark Imperium describes his leadership style in terms that should be read carefully. Whichever he said was most important to him depended on who he was speaking to. In this way, the Primarch directed the energies of his followers according to their own prejudices, without actually lying to them. That is the man who now guards the Emperor's oldest secret. He has drawn this line before, in smaller ways, and each time he draws it, the line moves. Imperium Secundus burned from the record for stability. The unnumbered sons quietly disbanded for political optics. The Primaris program concealed across 10 millennia because premature disclosure would have destabilized the institutions he needed to deploy them. The imperial cult preserved and guided, despite his personal contempt for everything it represents, because without it, the Imperium can't hold itself together long enough to be reformed. Each decision follows from the same calculation. Each decision makes the next one marginally more reachable.
Each one draws him one step closer to the method he came back to be better than, not through corruption, not through weakness, but through the simple, accumulated weight of governing something that can't survive its own truth. He isn't the emperor. He is still, in almost every meaningful way, the reformer he came back to be. He tells more truth than his father told. He challenges more comfortable assumptions, confronts more institutional rot, governs with more human consideration than the emperor ever permitted himself. But on this one subject, the two sons who were erased before the heresy even began, whose records carry error codes and imperial censure in the oldest surviving data structures in the galaxy. The difference between Guilliman and the Emperor has narrowed to nothing. The strongest objection to this argument deserves its full weight before the verdict. Games Workshop has maintained the Lost Primarchs as a deliberate editorial mystery for decades. According to community sources with apparent insider knowledge, GW has internally settled the fates of both Primarchs. The answer exists and simply hasn't been released. Every Black Library author who has written Guilliman in M42 operated under that creative constraint. The absence of Guilliman discussing the lost Primarchs on the page may reflect the author's obligation to preserve the mystery, not any in-universe decision by the character. There is no way to distinguish from the published text alone between a character who chose not to speak and a writer who chose not to write the scene. That limitation is real and should be named, but it reframes the theory rather than defeating it. The authors who wrote Dark Imperium made specific choices within their constraint. They had the Call Inferior raise the subject directly with Guilliman. They established his Lord Commander authority over Imperial archives. They confirmed the Sang Primus port's existence and accessibility through Call. They wrote him acknowledging the two failures to a priest without writing any follow-up investigation, any formal inquiry, any public statement. They could have written him as incurious or as facing a dead end. They wrote the conditions under which a character with full knowledge would behave if that character had decided to conceal what he knows. The second objection is the more pressing one. Guilliman confronts hard truths elsewhere. He told the ecclesiarchy its God is fallible, acknowledged the heresy's failures openly, spent his second life in explicit opposition to the emperor's policy of strategic concealment. His willingness to confront uncomfortable facts cuts against the idea that he would suppress anything. The answer is that the lost Primarchs represent a qualitatively different category. Acknowledging the emperor's fallibility is survivable. The Imperium has absorbed centuries of institutional doubt and kept fighting. What Malcador described, actions threatening the ideals of the entire Great Crusade, points toward a flaw so deep and so central that the Emperor's own response wasn't discipline or censure, but total historical erasure. Guilliman can price the difference between a truth that makes the faithful uncomfortable and a truth that makes them stop fighting. His silence isn't in spite of his honesty, it's a product of it. Roboute Guilliman came back to save the Imperium with the truth. He has told his subjects more honesty than they wanted, that their God is dying, that their history is a lie, that the future is darker than the past. He told a priest to his face that two of his brothers failed, and the emperor isn't infallible. He preserved in his private writing his deepest doubts about whether any of it was worth what it cost. There is almost nothing the Avenging Son won't say out loud, except this.
On the fate of the Furt and the 11th Legions, erased at least 43 years before Istvan V, suppressed so thoroughly that the goal was that nobody, 10,000 years later, could prove they existed. The most truthful Primarch in the galaxy has chosen the same silence his father chose. He holds the Lord Commander's authority over the archives containing the structural ghost of the deletion. He holds, through Call, the genetic survival of two erased Primarchs in the Sang Primus port. He was directly confronted with the subject by the Call Inferior in published canon and produced no public statement, no formal inquiry, no reform. He founded an order dedicated to unearthing the Imperium's buried history and has announced nothing about the two legions whose existence most strains that history.
The most rational Primarch alive ran the same numbers his father ran, across 10,000 years of civilizational decay, in an empire held together by faith in a founding mythology he personally knows is incomplete, and reached the same conclusion. The truth isn't worth the cost of telling it. Not now. Not in a galaxy already fracturing. Not to a population whose capacity to endure depends on not knowing this particular thing about the men who built the world they inhabit. He didn't fail to find the truth about the lost Primarchs. He found it, weighed it, and decided you were safer not knowing. That isn't weakness. That isn't hypocrisy. That is the same cold calculation the Emperor made, and the most disturbing thing about it's that the calculation is correct. The Imperium in M42 can't survive the truth about the 3rd and 11th. Guilliman, who understands this better than any living being, made the right call for the wrong reason, and the wrong call for the right reason simultaneously, in the way that only a rational mind running broken inputs can. I never wanted to be a tyrant, he thought. Perhaps my father didn't wish to be so either. History has roles for us that can't be denied. He is better than his father in almost every measurable way. He tells more truth, fights harder against the things that shouldn't have been built, governs with more transparency and more human consideration than the Emperor ever permitted himself. He is the best version of the Emperor's project that the Emperor's project is capable of producing. And on this one subject, on the two brothers who no longer exist in any record but the genetic archive he keeps and the silence he maintains, the distance between him and the Emperor has collapsed entirely. The Emperor would have been proud, and that is the most damning thing anyone could ever say about either of them. Subscribe for more stories like this one.